In the mountains of Lebanon, a remarkable case of alleged past life memories would occur in the 1960s. This case, investigated by reincarnation research pioneer Ian Stevenson, would prove unusual even among documented reincarnation accounts, as the subject experienced most of his memories not as a preschool child, as is more typical, but between the ages of 11 and 13. Abdallah Abu Hamdan was born around 1877 in the village of Garifa, Lebanon, where he would spend his entire life becoming a pillar of his Druze community. The Druze are an esoteric religious tradition that emerged from Islam in the 11th century that incorporates beliefs in reincarnation and the transmigration of souls. Abdallah accumulated considerable property that included an olive orchard and an olive oil press. For approximately 15 years, he served as a muqtar, the mayor of his village, a position of significant authority and respect. Abdallah's family life, however, was marked by profound challenges. His oldest son was developmentally challenged, while another son and daughter both suffered from a congenital disease that rendered them blind and mute. His youngest son, Kemal, emigrated to the United States sometime in the 1920s, sending money back to his father in Lebanon. According to family members who would later speak with investigators, Abdallah was not particularly close to his children, and Kemal's relationship with his father was notably poor. As a devout follower of the Druze religion, Abdallah became a sheikh, taking on a special religious role that required him to live under certain restrictions, including complete abstinence from alcohol and tobacco. He owned 5 sacred Druze books, which, in accordance with Druze custom, he never allowed to be taken from his house. 3 years before his death, at approximately age 65, Abdullah's life took a devastating turn. He was dismissed from his position as a muqtar for having falsified a document on behalf of a friend's son, removing a criminal record to help the young man secure employment. Around this same time, he purchased the oil press on credit, and the payments proved more than he could comfortably afford. His widow, Zina, would later claim that anxiety over these matters initiated the illness that led to his death, though his daughter-in-law disagreed about the cause, nevertheless confirming he was indeed under considerable stress. Abdallah spent time in hospital before being sent home under a physician's care. The doctor drew fluid from his abdomen once weekly, symptoms consistent with ascites, suggesting he might have died either of chronic heart failure or cirrhosis of the liver, though the former seems more likely given his abstinent lifestyle. The exact date of death remains uncertain, as Stevenson could find no written record and informants differed in their recollections. He placed it in February 1942, though he noted this could be more than 6 months off in either direction. 12 years later, on March 4, 1954, Suleiman Andari was born in Fallujah, approximately 30 kilometers from Garifa. Raised by his paternal grandmother and 2 paternal aunts after his father died when he was 2 years old, Suleiman began exhibiting unusual behaviours and making curious statements as a small child. He claimed he had lived in a village named Garifa, had owned an oil press and had children. When he was 5 or 6, family members heard him muttering names in his sleep one night. When he woke and they repeated the names back to him, he recognized them as the names of some of his previous children. The memories remained relatively dormant until Suleiman was about 11 years old. His maternal grandmother asked to borrow a religious book, and he sharply refused. When confronted about this rudeness, he explained that in his previous life he had never allowed his religious books to leave his house. Following this incident, Suleiman made a deliberate effort to recall his previous life. He now remembered that he had been the muqtar of Garifa and that his name had been Abdallah Abu Hamdan. It was proposed that he visit Garifa to seek verifications, and see if he could recognize places and people. Around the same time, a relative mentioned Suleiman's memories to residents of Garifa, who immediately recognized the individual he remembered having been and urged him to visit. Though initially reluctant, Suleiman eventually made 2 visits to Garifa in 1967, accompanied by his cousin and the cousin's wife, child and son-in-law as witnesses. By this time, Suleiman could name all 9 of Abdullah Abu Hamdan's children in order of birth. He made one error, saying he had a son named Salim who was blind, when actually his blind son was Nasib and Salim was his brother. He stated correctly that Abdullah's son Ahmed had emigrated to the USA, that Abdullah had owned many olive trees and an oil press located near a water fountain, and that Abdullah had owned 5 Druze sacred books. He accurately recalled that Abdullah had died at home in the arms of a nurse named Badr more than 20 years before, though actually about 25 years had passed. In Garifa, Suleiman recognized Abdullah's son Kemal, the nurse Badr, and an old woman who had been of Abdullah's generation. Though he correctly remembered Abdullah's widow's name Zina, he failed to recognize her. Stevenson noted that 25 years had passed and she was much changed. Suleiman recognized the building that housed the oil press, and when asked to name a place near Garifa, he named one about 2 kilometers away that was not well known to Garifa's residents, explaining how to get there. In one particular striking instant, the group left Kemal's house to visit Abdullah's former home. Instead of walking along the new paved road, Suleiman led them through a path down a steep hill and through an olive grove. This had been the main road during Abdullah's life, but has since been abandoned and was only faintly visible. However, Suleiman was unable to recognize Abdullah's house, possibly because it had been substantially renovated. According to informants in Suleiman's later childhood, whenever an oil merchant passed by, Suleiman would boast of having more and better oil. He also displayed behaviours suggestive of having lived a past life as an authority figure. Ian Stevenson, who first studied the case in March 1968 when Suleiman was 14, was struck by the serious adult manner the boy already showed. Suleiman preferred the company of adults to that of children, and tended to sit in the middle of groups in the manner of an important person. One of the aunts who raised him reported that as a child he objected to being treated as one, saying, "One does not scold me, I am an adult." Similarly, he would not submit to discipline by teachers, although he was a well-behaved child. He frequently referred to himself as being adult or already big. These behaviours led to him being nicknamed Mukhtar, which he liked. Yet Suleiman seemed chronically afflicted by an underlying shame, which as a young child he mentioned but did not explain. Stevenson conjectured it might have derived from Abdullah's embarrassing removal from his position, though Suleiman never mentioned remembering this specific event. Alone in his relatively non-religious family, Suleiman took a strong interest in religion, visiting the local religious meeting house, observing religious fasts, and expressed an interest in becoming a sheikh. On at least 2 occasions, Suleiman wept upon finding out about or being reminded of illnesses afflicting Abdullah's children, including one's blindness and another's lack of speech. Stevenson was particularly careful to investigate any possible connections between the 2 families, given that Suleiman was nearly a teenager when most of his past life memories emerged. Of 20 informants, only 1 had connections with both Fallujah and Garifa, Faiz Halibi, Suleiman's cousin by marriage. However, Faiz had lived in Garifa for only a little over a year between 1966 and 1968, before and during Suleiman's visits to the village, and well after Suleiman's first accurate statements. Faiz was absent when Suleiman remembered the bulk of them. It seemed unlikely that Faiz would have learned as much about Abdullah as Suleiman remembered, since Abdullah had died 25 years before. Faye stated he had never heard of Abdullah Abu Hamdan until he learned about Suleiman's statements. Stevenson returned to re-interview Suleiman and other informants in 1969 and made additional return visits in March 1970 and March 1972 to follow the case and Suleiman's development. At age 14, when Stevenson first met him, Suleiman's memories had begun to fade and he seemed somewhat depressed. A year later, when Stevenson visited again, Suleiman said he was trying to forget his past life and seemed more cheerful. Stevenson noted that Abdullah's heavy indebtedness, the embarrassment of his demotion, the unhappy relationships with his children, and Suleiman's relative poverty by comparison were all reasons why Suleiman might wish to forget the life. Suleiman left school at age 16 to apprentice with a blacksmith. He still thought about Garifa, but only occasionally. On Stevenson's next visit, when Suleiman was 18, he was still blacksmithing and said he retained his memories but remembered nothing new. Stevenson made his final visit in March 1978 to follow up on Suleiman, now an adult, but could only speak with other informants as Suleiman was away working in Saudi Arabia as an electrician. According to relatives, Suleiman had mostly stopped speaking of his former life, though a contemporary and friend said he sometimes mentioned it. About a year prior, he had returned to Lebanon on vacation, and the two friends had driven to Garifa more than once. Each time, Suleiman had pointed out Abdullah Abu Hamdan's house, and at least once he got out and showed his friends the oil press. According to one of the aunts who had raised Suleiman and his maternal great-uncle, he still had the habit of selecting the most prominent position in the room to sit and retained both the nickname Mukhtar and his liking for being called it. Stevenson considered that memories of having been Abdullah Abu Hamdan had an important influence on Suleiman's and Derry's development. His childhood situation, being raised fatherless, contrasted painfully with his previous position as a respected adult male community leader. Being a child regarded in a relatively trivial light was irksome to him, although he also recognised that carrying on the authoritative behaviour from his previous life would invite ridicule. Mocking use of the Mukhtar nickname by people outside his family confirmed these fears. Stevenson felt this discordance was likely the root of Suleiman's shame and depression from childhood to age 14, and that it subsided at age 16 due to his having attained some independence and a distinct male role in society as a blacksmith's apprentice. He continued happy and confident into adulthood, which Stevenson judged as likely due also to the fading of his memories. Stevenson noted that unpleasant past life associations were likely the cause of Suleiman's relative reluctance to speak of his memories, supporting the view of many Asian parents that children should not be encouraged to remember past lives. Ian Stevenson published this case report in his book Cases of Reincarnation Type, Volume 3, 12 Cases in Lebanon and Turkey in 1980, having interviewed Suleiman and 12 members of his family in Fallujah, and 5 members of the Hamdan family and 2 friends in Garifa. The case remains one of the more thoroughly documented instances of alleged past life memories emerging in later childhood rather than early childhood, offering unique insights into how such memories might affect psychological development across the lifespan.